The King and His Shadow. There are loves that history will never write down, not because they did not exist, but because the world refused to let them. This is one of those loves. Remember it anyway. Chapter 1. The Crown and the Man Who Carried It. The kingdom of Arenhal was not the largest kingdom in the known world, nor was it the wealthiest. But it was, by the testimony of travelers who passed through its stone archway gates, the most orderly. Its roads were smooth, its granaries were full, its courts were fair, or as fair as any court could be when the man sitting at the center of it all was still only 26 years old and had been king for barely 3 years. King Aldric Voss had not expected to be king. He had been the second son, which in the language of royal birth meant he was a footnote, a spare heir, a diplomatic tool, perhaps a general someday if ambition struck him. But his brother had died of a fever in his 19th year, and his father had followed 2 years later with grief pulling him down faster than the illness in his chest. And so the crown had come to Aldric like an unwanted inheritance. Heavy, cold, and arriving before he was ready. He managed, though. He managed because he had Caelen. Caelen Reese had come into royal service at 14, assigned as a page to the old king's court through a recommendation from a provincial magistrate who said the boy was too clever to waste on farming. By the time Aldric became king, Caelen was 24, brown-eyed and sharp-featured, with ink perpetually staining 2 fingers of his right hand and a habit of finishing other people's sentences when he thought they were taking too long. He had been assigned to the new king as chief personal assistant, a title that, in practice, meant he was the one who handed the king his documents in the right order, reminded him of names he had forgotten, intercepted nobles who wanted an audience at inconvenient hours, and, on late nights when the throne room had emptied and the candles were burning low, sat across a desk from Aldric and told him, plainly, when he was wrong. No one else told the king when he was wrong. That was, Aldric had come to understand, the rarest and most valuable thing a person could offer a monarch. He did not think of it as love. He thought of it as necessity. Their mornings had a ritual shape. Caelen arrived before dawn, always carrying a tray with 2 cups of dark tea, one for the king, one for himself, though he always positioned his own cup slightly away, as if to communicate that he was drinking out of function, not presumption. He would spread the morning correspondence across the long oak table in the study and arrange them in order, urgent matters first, ceremonial matters second, things that could wait at the bottom of the pile. Then he would stand, hands clasped behind his back, and wait for the king to emerge from his chambers. Aldric always emerged slightly disheveled. Hair not yet combed, outer robe loose, the sleep still soft around his eyes. And every morning, without a word, Caelen would hand him the tea first, before anything else. The king always took it with both hands. It was such a small thing. It did not mean anything. Caelen told himself this every morning for 3 years, and he believed it because love, real love, the dangerous kind, was not something you arrived at through small things. It was not built from the offering of tea and the receiving of it. Except, of course, it was. It always had been. He simply had not let himself see it yet. In Arenhal, as in most kingdoms of the age, the loving of men by other men was considered a crime against the natural order. The punishment varied by the whim of the court, but it was never mild. Aldric himself had inherited the law along with everything else, and though he had quietly let certain prosecutions lapse and quietly instructed his magistrates toward leniency, the law itself remained on the books. He had not yet found the courage to strike it. He did not examine why that might be. Caelen knew the law. He had copied it out himself once, when reorganizing the kingdom's legal archives. His handwriting had been very steady as he transcribed it. He had not let himself think about what it meant for him, for the particular shape of his own heart. He filed it under Moral Statutes, Volume 3, and did not open that drawer again. Chapter 2, What Neither of Them Said. Spring came to Arenhal with the particular cruelty of beautiful things. Warm mornings, the smell of river water, and courtiers who became restless and romantic in equal measure. The first crack in Caelen's careful architecture appeared on a morning ride. The usual page had fallen ill, and Caelen had been summoned at the last moment, and he had found himself sitting on a brown mare beside the king on the wide path along the kingdom's eastern ridge, where the oak trees stood ancient and enormous and the morning light came through them in long golden slivers. Aldric rode in silence for a while. Then he said, unprompted. "Do you ever think about what you'd be if you weren't doing this?" "I think I would be a librarian," Caelen said. "Or perhaps I would have gone north to the university. Read philosophy until I went blind from the pages." He glanced sideways. "What would you be?" Aldric was quiet a long moment, his hands loose on the reins. Unusual for him, a man who in most things held on tightly. "I don't know," he said finally. "I'm not sure I was ever allowed to be anything other than what I am." Caelen looked at him then. Truly looked, not as an assistant cataloging a problem but as a person seeing another person, and something shifted quietly in his chest. Something small. Something he immediately classified as concern for the king's well-being and filed away where he would not have to look at it. The second crack came 3 weeks later in the library. They had been working late on a trade agreement, both of them reaching for the same shelf at the same moment, and they stopped very close to each other in the warm, paper-smelling air. Caelen was aware, in a way he was not usually aware, of the king's height and the particular gray of his eyes, which Caelen had looked at approximately 10,000 times and never once registered as anything other than the king's eyes. He registered them now. He stepped back. He retrieved the volume. He returned to his side of the table and did not look up for the rest of the evening. That night, in his small room off the eastern corridor, he turned the feeling over the way he turned over problems. Systematically, from every angle. And when he had examined it from every angle, he understood what it was. He put that understanding in the same drawer as Moral Statutes, Volume 3, and locked it with great deliberateness. Then he lay down and was very still for a very long time. Aldric, for his part, was less systematic. He simply found himself noticing things. The sound of Caelen's footsteps before he entered and how Aldric's attention sharpened without him deciding to let it. The way Caelen's expression changed when he worked through a complex problem. Not quite a frown, more an inward focusing. The way he laughed. Rarely because he was reserved, but when something genuinely struck him, the laugh was quick and real and always seemed to surprise him slightly. Aldric noticed these things and did not name them. He was a king. He was practical. There was no room in the machinery of statecraft for whatever formless thing had apparently been growing in him for 3 years without permission. He set it aside with the efficiency of a man who had learned very young that feelings were a luxury. He did not look too closely at what he was setting aside. Then the Valteri ambassador arrived, and they ran out of time not to look. Chapter 3. The Proposal and the Breaking. The ambassador from Valteri arrived on a Tuesday in early summer, attended by a retinue of 40 and bearing gifts wrapped in the blue silk that signified diplomatic formality. Valteri was the neighboring kingdom to the south, larger than Arenhal, older, with mountains along its border that had for generations made trade difficult and war occasional. The gifts were presented. The feast was held. And on the second day, in the formal receiving hall, the ambassador presented the true purpose of his visit. King Donner of Valteri had a daughter, the Princess Marit, 22 years old, educated, accomplished, considered a great beauty. And King Donner, who wished peace with Arenhal, was proposing a formal union. The court erupted into pleased murmuring. This was diplomacy at its most elegant. The court chancellor was already calculating the trade benefits. Aldric sat in his throne and kept his expression neutral. He did not look at Caelen. Caelen, standing in his customary position at the king's right shoulder, kept his expression neutral. He did not look at the king. Both of them were very good at keeping neutral expressions. They had years of practice. The official response would come within the week, the ambassador was told. He expressed gracious satisfaction and was escorted to his chambers. The court cleared. Aldric walked toward his study without speaking to anyone. Caelen followed 2 steps behind, as always. They entered. The door closed. Silence. "Write a response to the ambassador," the king said, standing at the window with his back to the room. "Thank him for Valteri's gracious proposal. Indicate that the king will give the matter his fullest consideration. Of course. Shall I note a timeline? 10 days. He was already turning toward the writing desk when the king said, very quietly, "Caelen." He stopped. "Yes. What do you think? About the proposal?" Something in the stillness of the question was different. I think a marriage alliance with Valtteri would be strategically advantageous, Caelen said carefully. The border disputes would likely cease. The mountain passes would open for trade. The political benefit is clear. Silence. That's the strategic assessment. I asked what you think. Caelen's hands were still. His heartbeat was inconvenient. I think a king must make the choices his kingdom requires of him. Aldric turned from the window then. He looked at Caelen with an expression that was open, somehow, and uncertain, not an expression he wore often. And if the king were to find that he could not, he stopped, began again. What if the king didn't want the marriage? The question hung in the air between them like smoke. For a full 3 seconds, a very long time to look at a king, Caelen let himself look. Something locked away began pressing against the lock. Then, he said at last, carefully, the king would need to weigh what he wants against what his kingdom needs. It was not the answer Aldric was asking for. They both knew it. The jealousy arrived without warning some days later, as jealousy tends to. It arrived at a diplomatic luncheon when the ambassador mentioned that Princess Marate was very intelligent, that she spoke 3 languages, had an interest in governance, could hold her own in any political discussion. Caelen had looked at his plate and thought, with a clarity that was almost painful, she will be able to finish his sentences. That was when he understood the full size of what he was feeling. Not in the library, not on the Eastern Ridge. Now, in a room full of people, realizing that the particular intimacy of knowing someone well enough to anticipate their thoughts was exactly the kind of intimacy a wife would naturally possess. An intimacy he had believed, without ever letting himself admit it, was his. He excused himself and took a long walk through the lower gardens where no one would see him. When he came back, the king looked up with something like relief on his face, quickly hidden, but there. Where did you go? Aldric asked. Not sharply, carefully. The gardens. I needed air. Caelen, are you all right? Caelen raised his eyes to the king's face. I'm quite well, your majesty. You're lying. The bluntness startled an almost laugh out of him. I'm fine, he said more gently. I was just thinking. Aldric watched him for a moment longer than was necessary. Then he reached over and, instead of taking the letters, placed his hand briefly on Caelen's. Just the edge of it, fingers over knuckles, no more than 2 seconds. He withdrew it immediately. Caelen's hand remained very still on the desk. What do the Eastern Territories want? Aldric asked quietly. Flood relief, Caelen said after a moment. They had a bad spring. All right, arrange it. Yes, your majesty. He arranged it. He did not speak of the hand. Neither of them did. But something between them had shifted, and both of them knew it, and the shift was the kind that cannot be undone. Chapter 4. The leaving, the chase, the confession. Caelen made the decision on a Thursday. He arranged his reasons the way he arranged documents, by importance, by necessity, and arrived at a conclusion that felt, underneath all its logic, like stepping off the edge of something tall. He would request a transfer to administrative duties in the northern provinces. He would frame it as professional ambition. He would train his replacement thoroughly, leave no loose ends, and go north and become someone who did not love a king from 2 steps behind and slightly to the right. He wrote the transfer request on Thursday evening, drafted and revised until it gave away nothing. He did not sleep. He went to the study before dawn, as always, set out the correspondence, prepared the tea with dried orange peel, as he always did now, ever since the king had once mentioned, months ago, that he had loved the flavor as a child. He placed the transfer request on top of the morning pile. When Aldric came in and read it, he read it twice. Caelen watched the king's face during those 2 readings the way you don't look directly at certain kinds of light. No, the king said. Your Majesty. No, I won't accept this. It is a formal administrative request. You're required to. I am a king. I am not required to do anything. His eyes came up, and they were not uncertain now. They were entirely, frighteningly open. Don't go. Just that. Don't go. No ceremony. No political layering. The princess. I haven't accepted the proposal. You will need to. The kingdom. I said I haven't accepted it. He came around the desk. Caelen should have stepped back but did not. Tell me why you're really leaving. The silence was enormous. Outside, a Renhal was waking. Carts on stone, distant bells. A kingdom going about its morning without any knowledge of the two men inside this room. You know why, Caelen said. It was all he said. But it was enough. Something in the king's face broke open, not shattering, but revealing, showing what had always been inside. I do, Aldric said. Because it's the same reason I can't sleep and can't stop. He stopped. His jaw worked. Caelen, I don't. Quiet. Aching. Please don't say it. Why? Because if you say it I won't be able to leave. And I have to leave, Aldric. His hands clasped behind his back, fingers gripping hard. You're going to be married. You're going to have a queen and I cannot watch that. I cannot hand you your tea every morning and watch that. Then I won't get married. You are a king. I know what I am. Then you know this is impossible. He turned toward the door. Caelen. He stopped because he could not help it. If the law were different, would you stay? Caelen stood with his hand near the door handle and the question sitting on him like a stone. The law is what it is, he said. He left. Aldric waited 2 days. Not out of passivity but out of the recognition that pursuing someone immediately after a confession is a form of pressure that can break rather than mend. He spent those 2 days thinking precisely. He talked to his chancellor and formally, quietly, declined the Valtteri proposal, citing diplomatic sensitivity, need for time, a dozen careful reasons that all meant no. He sent the ambassador south with gifts and a graciously worded refusal. Then he went to find Caelen. He was in the archives, as Aldric had known he would be. Caelen's one reliable refuge, the room full of boxes and old documents where he went when he needed to be alone and could justify it with work. Aldric pushed the door open and found him at the long table at the back, surrounded by files, 2 candles lit against the afternoon shadow. Caelen looked up. His face went through several expressions before settling on something careful. I declined the Valtteri proposal, Aldric said, pulling out the chair across from him without ceremony and sitting down. And 3 other pending marriage negotiations that Chancellor Dorth had been quietly arranging without telling me. He looked across the table. I'm going to review the law, the one in Volume 3. I should have done it 2 years ago. Caelen's hands stilled on the document he was holding. Aldric, think about what you're saying. I've thought about it for 2 days. I love you. He said it plainly, the way Caelen had always said plain things to him. I should have said it before you tried to leave. I should have said it a year ago. I didn't, because I am apparently very good at not letting myself look at things I'm afraid of. A beat. I love you. And I'm asking you to stay. The archives were quiet. Dust motes in the candlelight. All of Arenhal's history in boxes around them. You're going to make my life very complicated, Caelen said finally. Aldric smiled, the real one, not the political one. You've made mine complicated for 3 years. It seems fair. Caelen exhaled. He looked down. Then, slowly, he reached across the table and placed his hand over the king's. They sat like that for a while in the quiet, adding a small invisible line to all the history surrounding them. Chapter 5. The Small Language of Love. They were careful because they had to be. The law still stood. They did not change the outward shape of things. Caelen still arrived before dawn, still arranged the correspondence, still stood 2 steps behind in formal settings. To all appearances, king and assistant, as always. But the small things changed. The tea had always been 2 cups. Now sometimes their hands were close when they were passed, and neither moved away. When they worked late and the palace grew quiet, the silence between them had changed. It was no longer the silence of professional restraint. It was something warmer, something that sat comfortably without requiring words. Aldric started leaving books on the side table near Caelen's chair. Philosophy, natural history, once a collection of dry economic theory Caelen had mentioned wanting to read. He never said anything about them. Caelen never mentioned them. They appeared and disappeared like a quiet conversation in a language only the 2 of them spoke. Caelen continued putting orange peel in the tea. Aldric continued taking the cup with both hands. These were small things. They did not look like love to anyone watching. But that is what love looks like when it is kept safe and close. It looks like ordinary kindnesses so consistent they become a language. It looks like remembering. It looks like 2 cups of tea on a tray at dawn. They had very little time with this language before everything began to break. Duke Aaron Voss had been watching. Aldric's stepbrother. His father's son from a first marriage, 10 years older, born to a woman who had died young and never been mourned by the court that replaced her. Had grown up in the palace knowing, with the particular clarity that unwanted children develop, that he would receive nothing that was not explicitly demanded for. He had cultivated his resentment with the patient industry of a man who intended, eventually, to do something with it. When the Valteri ambassador arrived, he had seen the way the king didn't look at his assistant during the proposal announcement. The way the assistant didn't look at the king. The very deliberateness of their not looking. He had made a careful note of this. He had noted the declined proposal. And he had, over weeks, added these careful notes into a picture he found extremely useful. He sent a private message south to Valteri's chancellor. There is something you should know about why the proposal was declined. Chapter 6. The Architecture of Betrayal. King Donner of Valteri understood insult. He had sent his daughter as a proposal gift, his most valuable political asset, and had been refused. Politely, elaborately, but refused. The refinement of the refusal made it worse. It made him feel managed rather than respected. He sent no immediate response. He was patient, King Donner. He preferred that grievances age before he acted on them. He received Duke Aaron's letter. He read it carefully. He called his chancellor and his general and several other men, and what began in that room was not spoken of afterward, but its shape became clear over the following weeks as letters moved back and forth between a duke in his cold northern province and a king with a wounded pride and a mountain border. The plan was as follows. Valteri would declare a formal border dispute, a legitimate grievance over a section of mountain territory that had been disputed for decades. This would require Aldric's attention at the northern front. Meanwhile, a small Valteri force, not an army, nothing official, would move through alternative passes using maps the Duke had provided. Their target was not the king. Their target was Caelen Rees. His death, in what could be framed as a bandit attack or a territorial accident, would accomplish 2 things. Wound the king in the most personal way possible, and draw Aldric into a reckless retaliation. If the king marched on Valteri, and Aaron believed he would, believed that love had made his stepbrother exploitable in ways that cold ambition could not be, then Valteri would have justification for war. And in the confusion of war, a king could die many ways. A stepbrother could find himself the surviving heir. Aaron believed it was an elegant plan. He was right that it was elegant. He was wrong that it could be controlled. Chapter 7. The Abduction. It happened on an afternoon when the king was in a full court session, something that would take hours, which Caelen had excused himself from to attend to briefing documents in the administrative annex. He was there alone, or nearly. Clerks worked in the outer office but not the inner room. The men who came through the window were very quiet. That was the first thing he registered. Their quietness, almost courteous, which was somehow more frightening than violence would have been. He fought, because he was not a gentleman and had grown up in a provincial town where you learned certain practicalities. He upended the ink well as a weapon and broke one man's nose with a book and made enough noise that a clerk in the outer office started toward the door. Then something connected with the back of his head and the room went sideways. He woke in the back of a covered cart. Hands bound. Head ringing with a low underwater ache. He lay very still and assessed, moving south, based on the angle of light through the canvas. Fast but carefully, men who didn't want to be noticed. He was alive, which meant he was needed somewhere. He turned this over with the same systematic calm he brought to difficult correspondence and understood Valteri. Someone wanted him in Valteri, where Arenhal's king had no authority. He thought about who had access to this kind of plan, and the answer arrived quickly, with the unpleasant clarity of recognizing something you had not been watching for. He thought of Aldric. Not his title Aldric, who left books on side tables, who had said don't go without ceremony, who had taken the tea with both hands for 3 years. Caelen pressed his eyes shut. He hoped Aldric would not start a war. He hoped this with the full knowledge that it was a useless hope. He began, methodically, to work on the rope around his wrists. Aldric came out of court to find the administrative annex in quiet chaos. Clerks in the corridor, voices overlapping. The inner office door standing open. Ink spilled across the floor and a chair overturned. He had both his breath and his rational thought back within 30 seconds, because he was a king and crises required function. But those 30 seconds were among the worst of his life. By evening they had pieced together what had happened. A covered cart scene leaving the eastern gate. The guard bribed to look away. Found, arrested, interrogated. South, they were told. South. Aldric stood in the study that night with the candles burning and the correspondence untouched and the 2 cups still on the tray from that morning, and understood with a cold, total clarity that was almost peaceful that he would burn the world down if he had to. He was a king. He had an army. He began making preparations within the hour. He did not know about Aaron's last letter, the adjustment, sent quietly south, changing the plan. Aaron could not risk Caelen talking. He could not risk him being found. Finish it, the letter said. Aldric did not know. He only knew that a covered cart had gone south, and the man he loved was in it, and he was going to bring him home. Chapter 8. The same afternoon, in Valteri, they took him to a stone building near the border's eastern pass. Empty, unidentified, the kind of place that exists in border territories to hold things that aren't supposed to be found. He had not gotten through the ropes, but he had observed everything and remembered it with the precision of a man whose entire life depended on his memory. On the second morning, he understood from the changed demeanor of his guards, the way they stopped bringing food, the way they avoided his eyes, that the nature of his situation had shifted. He was very still. He thought about Aldric. He thought about the archive and the hand over his hand, and the orange peel in the tea. He thought about 3 years of mornings laid out behind him like a country he had lived in without knowing how beloved it was until he was looking at it from a distance. He thought about Moral Statutes, Volume 3, and how it had never seemed until lately to apply to him specifically. He hoped Aldric would not start a war. He hoped this knowing it was useless. He thought, I should have stayed. I wasted weeks trying to leave. He thought, he knows. He knows I love him. I told him without saying it and he said it without waiting. That is enough. That is enough to have had. He was quiet. He remembered everything. And then the door opened and the men who entered were not his guards. In Arenhal at the northern border, Aldric had not yet crossed into Valteri's territory. He stood at the border with 3,000 soldiers and the specific, clean rage of a man who has turned grief into fuel. He had sent ahead a demand for Caelen's immediate release and safe return. Diplomatic language so controlled it was almost more frightening than a threat. No reply had come. The silence was answer enough. He did not know that Aaron had sent word ahead, not to Valteri, but to certain men within his own border camp. Men placed there over years, quietly, with patience. Men who thought of a duke as their true lord rather than a king. He was riding along the ridge at the edge of camp when the arrows came from the tree line. 2 of his guard fell immediately. The rest formed a protective ring, which was the training, but the attackers had planned for the ring. There were more in the trees, positioned for exactly this formation. It lasted less than 10 minutes, which is both a very long and a very short time, depending on which side of it you are on. Aldric fought because he believed a king should be able to fight his own battles, and because he was thinking, even now in the screaming chaos of it, about a man with ink on his fingers who had tried to leave and been asked to stay. He was thinking about whether Caelen was alive. He was thinking about the orange peel in the tea and the books on the side table and the hand over his in the archives. He was not thinking about his own mortality, which was perhaps the problem. He went down not to arrows but to a blade. From a man who came from the right when the guard's attention was left. And the blow was final. And the king of Arenhal fell on the grass of his own border in the last light of late afternoon. He did not know it was the same afternoon. He did not know that at the same hour, in a stone building near Valteri's eastern pass, the man he loved had gone quiet in his own irreversible way. They did not know. That is the thing that has no consolation. They did not know. Chapter 9. Two graves on the same day. The funerals were held separately in different countries on the same day. This was coincidence, or the particular cruelty of how things sometimes align, as if the world, having kept them from each other in life, saw fit to grant them this one terrible symmetry in death. In Arenhal, the king was buried in the royal mausoleum with the full ceremony of a sovereign lost in the line of duty. The chancellor wept. The court wore black for 30 days. The nobles argued about succession and what the border situation with Valteri meant for the kingdom going forward. These were important questions. They were also very small compared to the fact of the man in the stone tomb, who had taken his tea with both hands every morning for 3 years and had finally, in an archive full of dust and history, said "I love you" out loud and meant every word. Someone placed 2 cups of tea near the casket before it was sealed. No one knew who. In Valteri, in a village near the Eastern Pass, where the people who found him did not know who he was but could see that he was someone's person, Caelen Reese was given a grave marked with a wooden post and the date, and a small pile of stones placed by a woman who had seen his face and thought he looked like someone who had loved someone very much. She was right, of course. Both graves were marked on the same day. Both in the afternoon. Both without the other present. This is what history would not write down. But what should be remembered? That they did not die in each other's arms, which is the ending granted to certain loves in certain stories. That they had no final scene, no last words across the distance, no moment of knowing. They had separate pages, separate chapters, separate countries. The only thing they shared at the end was the timing, that strange and brutal coincidence of the same afternoon, the same failing light over 2 different pieces of the world. Neither knew the other was dying. Neither knew the other had died. Caelen, in his last minutes, had been quiet and precise, remembering everything the way he always had, holding the warmth of the archive and the hand over his and the sound of a name said like it meant something, holding all of it with both hands the way the king had always held the tea. Aldric, in his last minutes, had been thinking about brown eyes and a rare laugh that always surprised the person laughing, thinking I was going to change the law, I should have done it sooner, thinking with the last of his precision. At least he knows. He knows I love him. Both of them right about the only thing that mattered. Both of them wrong about the other still being alive to carry it. The graves were dug at the same hour, in different earth, in countries that had spent generations in dispute and would continue disputing long after both men were gone. The earth that held them did not know each other. The graves would never share the same sky at the same moment. Duke Arenvos, who had arranged all of it, was found out within the month. The bribed border guard had talked, and the web of letters unraveled the way such webs always do, eventually. He was arrested, tried, and executed with the full weight of Arenhal's law. He had wanted to be a king. He died as a traitor, which is what he was. But Aldric was already buried. And Caelen was already buried. And justice, when it arrived alone. There is a kind of love that history forgets on purpose. It forgets because the world that contained it had decided, in its laws and its customs and its cramped moral imagination, that such love was a crime. And when you declare something a crime, you do not make it stop existing. You only make it exist in secret, in archives, in locked drawers, in small things that look ordinary from the outside. The king left books on a side table. The assistant put orange peel in the tea. The king took the cup with both hands every morning for 3 years. These were not crimes. These were a language. A quiet, private, persistent language that 2 people had built for each other in the only space the world allowed them. The space between what was said and what was meant, between what was permitted and what was true. History did not record them. But they were there. They were entirely, completely, irreversibly there. The tea was warm. The books were read. They loved each other. It happened. Remember it. And, for everyone who has ever loved in a world that said they couldn't, you were not wrong to love. The world was wrong about what love is allowed to be.